It's a pleasure to be here, and what I'm going to try to do in the next 15 or so minutes is kind of walk you through a very high level, for lack of a better way to put it, sort of macro view of current world energy demands and projected world energy demands. And typically when I do something on projections, I will have a couple of slides to basically tell you why forecasting is so horrible. But I'm going to forego that and just kind of jump to the point. Don't look at what I'm going to show you as, oh, well, that's a point estimate, that's where we're going. Take away from what we talk about, the lessons that are embedded therein, because the value of forecasting is not the point estimate, it's actually the exercise itself. Because what you have to do is you have to actually come to grips with a lot of different things and really fully understand all the drivers within a particular market before you can make a forecast. And so I'm going to talk a lot about things that are influencing energy demands around the world. And you'll actually hear me say some things that are regional in nature, as well as global in nature. But quite frankly, that really is an indicator of how not only demand is going to change and where growth is going to come from, but why. And so from there, we should be able to talk a little bit about bringing things back a little bit closer to home, and I'll do that at the very end and talk a little bit about natural gas demand specifically in the United States and where our work actually indicates that might go. I like to start any kind of demand talk off with this picture. This is a classic Earth at night picture, right? It was made famous by National Geographic many years ago. Got lots of satellites up there floating around in space. They're taking lots of photographs all the time. You can take the photographs on clear nights, create a composite, and you get this picture. And you might say, well, all right, well, that's interesting. We all know what that is. But from an energy standpoint, in particular energy demand, this is a very telling picture. What do you see? You see little white dots. Those are where the lights are on. Why is that important? Well, because that's where we consume energy. So you can actually look at this picture and see geographically how diverse energy demand actually is. And that's actually a really important point for a host of reasons. We can get into the supply side and talk about what that means for patterns of trade, so on and so forth, which I will touch on at the very end of my talk. But the other thing you can actually begin to see when you start to look at this in a time-lapse sense is where certain areas of the world that appear very bright have been bright for a while and kind of just sit there, right? So eastern half of the United States, Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, the developed world, basically, right? All the lights are on. The other thing you can see is areas that are actually over time growing brighter. And this is where you start to look at the east coast of China. You start to look at India. And then you can actually see areas where the lights just aren't on. Right? And I draw your attention to sub-Saharan Africa. Right? There are actually a lot of people that live there. You go to West Africa, there's a lot of people that live there. And I heard a really interesting comment about the Ebola crisis that was made actually at an event I was at last night in Houston. And I thought it was very apt. They said the issue is not healthcare, the issue is energy, because what is lacking in that part of the world? Access to modern energy services, access to clean water. So all of this stuff impacts all sorts of things, right? And when you start thinking about that and you start looking at this picture, you quickly realize that there are places in the world where the lights are going to go brighter. There are places in the world where the lights are going to come on. And then there are places in the world where the lights are going to stay on. But what that allows you to do is then think about, well, what does that mean for the patterns of energy demand around the world? What does that mean for the types of fuel choices that ultimately are adopted around the world? And a lot of times when we talk about natural gas demand specifically, we like to be very US-centric and focus only on what's happening here. We have to realize that we're talking about a global commodity space that is becoming increasingly just that, global. Right? Oil's been there, but these other commodities are migrating into that space in a very rapid way. Great example, natural gas trade. We look at liquefied natural gas trade in particular. You go back to 2003, so just over 10 years ago, less than 5% of global LNG trade was done on a short-term or spot basis. Today, that number is closer to a quarter of all trade. So things are changing, right? And that begins to put into perspective what the likelihood of different regions of the world accessing an abundance of natural gas resources in other regions of the world might actually be. That's actually all very important, not only from understanding flow lines of trade and particular trade relationships that might evolve and what that means ultimately for the demand for the fuel, but also geopolitically it matters, right? Because that's the one thing about energy we can't ever get away from, right? It is a political commodity, very, 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 very much so. So when we look at this picture, there's a lot of information here, right? There's a lot of information here. One thing I always like to point out, for those of you who know your geography, that's South Korea. And just to the last point I just made about geopolitics and energy and sort of access to energy, it's not an island, but it looks like one at night. So that's a really sort of telling one to see, right? When you go over here to this part of the world, you really don't see many lights on, right? That's really interesting. You go to Australia, you can see where population centers are. You go to India, you can see where population centers are. China, where economic growth and population centers are. These parts of the world, the lights have been on for a long time. So this actually raises a really important point that I'm going to get to as I go through the next couple of slides. What does that mean? Well, the stage of economic development in which a particular country is in has dramatic implications for how much energy demand you can expect to come as those countries materialize, as those countries continue to grow. So what we do at the Baker Institute is actually develop forecasts from the bottom up. We actually look at demand by fuel type, by sector across every country in the world. What you're seeing here is an aggregation of all that information, okay? And we look at total primary energy requirement because that's basically all the energy that's required to facilitate end-use consumption. You're looking basically at primary energy, so crude oil, coal, natural gas, nuclear, hydro. One thing to draw your attention to, because it always raises eyebrows, is this green bit at the top is what we call renewables. Historically, back here, this renewable space is not what we think about in the West when we think about renewables, right? We think about wind and solar, right? I've separated hydro for a very important reason, because there's actually a big constituency that begins to think of hydro not as necessarily a renewable fuel, so I kind of keep that separate. But anyway, most of that green on a global basis is combustible renewables and waste. So it's like, rural households in India burning dung and trash. So these are not environmentally benign renewables, right? But what you see, and it's not indicated in the picture, is that the total share of that type of renewable energy use as we go through time begins to fade, and you begin to see stronger growth, but largely driven in the Western, more developed economies of the renewables that we think of as environmentally benign energy sources, so wind and solar. The one thing I want you to take away from this picture is when you look at this is crude oil, natural gas, coal. Natural gas of the hydrocarbon sources is by far the fastest growing. We're going to come to that in a few minutes. But notice, this is 2013 where this line is. Majority of the world's energy consumption is hydrocarbon based. The projection is for that not to change very much. You might ask, well, how is that possible? You hear about all these policies to promote, growth of certain types of energy sources. And yes, that's true, but when you start talking about things on a micro level or a country-specific level, you have to recognize that that's actually a really small drop in the bucket. Okay, so even if Germany goes all green, it doesn't change this picture hardly at all. Okay, so you have to recognize this picture is an aggregation of everything that's going on across the world. Talk about China, President Xi and President Obama just had a handshake agreement on climate change, right? And that's, I sort of jokingly say, it's a nice step forward. It will, if it's actually turned into something actionable, have an implication for energy demands. But at the end of the day, you have to remember the Chinese have said, okay, we're not going to do anything until 2030, right? Really interesting point to make here is, I don't know, most people don't realize this, but the UN population projections, 2030 is the year when China's population is projected to turn over. So nice little coincidence there. But you start layering these things in and you realize, okay, basically what we have is an MOU, which MOUs in the commercial world are done all the time. It's basically a letter of intent, but they don't often come to anything actionable. So I would hit pause on reacting to the handshake at this point, okay? I think in the US you're going to see some movement. I think that is going to happen, and we can discuss that in Q&A because I think it will have implications for energy demands, but and also what happens in the policy front, which I'm more than happy to discuss later. But those issues are going to be affecting demand growth at the margin. So what's happening to fuel use at the margin? When you look at these long-term projections, one of the things you have to remember is that the energy industry, particularly on the demand side, is incredibly capital intensive. That's something that we often forget, right? So if I build a power plant, it's basically there, it's going to be operational. The fixed cost is sunk at that point for the next 30, 40, sometimes 50 years. Okay? So when we start to move down a particular path, we lock ourselves into particular modes of fuel consumption for decades. Great example of this is in the United States. What happened during the 70s, we were worried about running out of natural gas, so we didn't build any new natural gas power generation facilities. What did you see in the early 80s? Massive growth of coal-fired generation capacity. There's a lot of people now that are looking back at that wishing, why did we do that, right? Particularly those that are worried about CO2 emissions and other pollution concerns. So, the point is though, those facilities are still, they have useful life. So if you retire something that still has useful life, you bear a stranded cost, and that's something that most commercial entities aren't necessarily willing to do. I'm going to come back to this point when I talk about China in just a second specifically. So you can break down each one of those hydrocarbon fuel sources into, its sum across countries. And so what you see here is the bottom wedge, right, the gray wedge, which is crude oil. And I've put a couple of countries in here sort of to highlight where they sit. Note the colors because I've redacted the names in the subsequent two slides. But one thing I want to point out is when you look at crude oil demand, projected crude oil demand, it's relatively soft in terms of growth in the US. There's really not much growth projected at all. Okay. It's also the same can be said of Western Europe, which is basically this group of countries here. You look at Japan, same thing. So why am I pointing out the countries where the lights were already on, right? Well, it's because they're already developed countries. When you have a developed economy, the income effect is not the principal driver of energy demands anymore, okay? The thing that actually drives energy demand in those countries rather than income growth are changes in technology and changes in price, the two of which are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And so when you start looking at forecasting demands in the West, right, or the developed world, don't expect to see a lot of growth in any of these places and any of these fuels. Okay? That's because they've already gone through the phase of development where energy demand grows the most rapidly, which is the industrialization phase of development. You're talking about post-industrial societies where most income growth doesn't go into driving your car more, doesn't go into building another factory. Most income growth actually goes into financial services, wealth creation, things that really don't require massive amounts of energy input. You go to other countries, China, India, developing Asian economies, and you see a very different picture because income growth there is the driving force for projecting energy demand. It's largely because of where they are in their phase of economic development. So as you start to step forward through time, you actually see that $1 of growth in China in terms of its impact on energy demand is very different than $1 of growth in the United States. Okay? Great example of this, at current rates of growth in China and projected rates of growth in China, it is highly likely that by 2030, you could see 400 million people move into the middle class in China alone. That is massive. That's more people than are in the United States altogether. So what do we do when we start to go from low income to middle income to upper income? Well, we go from low income to middle income. The things that we think of as basic necessities and subsistence items are foregone conclusions once we sort of pass that bridge. That's roof over our head, food on our table, clothes on our backs. That's really what we're concerned with first. Okay. Then as we start to move into that middle class phase, what do we start to think about doing? Start thinking about doing things like buying automobiles and then start driving those automobiles, right? That's what's driving these pictures down here, okay? Notice really importantly, all the slope in this graph is coming from down here. So what that tells you is that when you're thinking about projecting what demands for different fuels are going to be, you really got to focus on those countries that are emerging and that are large. Right? Between China and India alone, you're talking about over 2.2 billion people. That's a lot of people, right? And so you're talking about a tremendous amount of growth potential in terms of energy demands associated with economic growth. This is the coal picture. A lot of people will look at this and say, there's no way, right? Because most people don't realize this until they see it, right? You know it, but you don't know it. You go back here to the early 2000s, China and the US, basically neck and neck in terms of coal consumption. Look what's happened since then. This is 2013. China now consumes roughly 2.5 times more coal than the United States does. Okay. So you might say, well, what's going on there? Well, I'll tell you an interesting little tidbit. First thing you do when you're developing is you try to access the cheapest energy sources you can to facilitate continued economic growth and development. That generally means you use what you have first. Okay. US was no different. Western European countries, no different. As a matter of fact, if you look at the energy mix in the United States, the energy mix in terms of share of different fuel types and total energy in the United States back in 1920 looks really similar to the energy mix in China today. So that kind of begins to tell you, well, how does that compare when you start looking at per capita income levels on a real dollar adjusted basis? Well, they're not very different, actually. You say, well, what's going on there? Well, what's going on in China is you see a lot of infrastructure development, you see a lot of industrial activity, you see a lot of things that are very energy intensive in nature. Now, as you start to see more people move into higher levels of income, then some of those activities are going to shift into financial services, a greater proportion of them will shift into financial services, general wealth creation, taking vacations, the kind of things we do, right? And you'll actually begin to see the fuel mix change. Really important point here that I mentioned earlier about energy infrastructure, being critical when you start thinking about forecasting demands. In China, there's a massive amount of infrastructure that has been built that is dedicated to moving coal around the country and combusting it. Okay? About 60% of that infrastructure was built in the last decade. It's not going away. Everybody likes to start talking about they're going to retire coal, they're going to do some things, particularly close to cities. One of the things they're going to start doing is actually enforcing the use of environmental controls on existing power plants. I see that coming down the pipe. But don't expect them to start shutting down en masse, all the coal plants that they have in that country. It would cripple the economy. It's that simple. Okay? So when we're making these projections, we have to begin to realize what's going on here is largely driven by income growth, particularly in the bottom end of this spectrum. Notice up here, the US, coal actually, it's kind of blocked out by the scale, but coal demand doesn't grow, right? It actually shrinks slightly in the forecast time horizon. And this brings me to natural gas. Very similar kind of view when you start thinking about what's going to happen globally in terms of what's driving the slope of this line long term. It's largely driven by what's happening down here at the bottom end of the picture. Okay? Again, this is an economic development story. We're talking about long-term projections, right? Really interesting point to raise, though, is this blue line among all those other fuel sources that I showed in the US, and I'm going to come back to this in a minute when I focus on the US specifically. It's kind of hard to see, but there's actually growth in the US and natural gas demand. Okay? Some of this is fuel switching in the power sector, right? Some of which is policy motivated. Okay? But a lot of it is actually driven by price. Okay? A lot of it is driven by sort of reindustrialization in certain parts of the country. And so you do see this. It's not massive, right? But you see growth. That's a really important point. US natural gas demand. So this is what we have by sector. So I've just taken that blue bit and sort of pulled it out so we can kind of see what we're seeing. Interestingly, most of the growth that you see in the industrial sector in the projected in the forecast time horizon really it's occurring now. So once we get sort of beyond the next couple of years, you start to see a stabilization in demand. You don't really see continued growth there. And there's a couple of reasons for that, which I'm happy to sort of dive into. One of which has to do with what's happening at the top end here. Right? This is in power generation. Power generation demand is projected to grow by far more strongly than any of the other sectors. Now, why is that? Well, you're going to have some retirements of some old coal facilities going forward, which would have happened largely anyway. Okay, that's a really important point. But layer into that some of the things that are going on. It's been termed the war on coal. I don't like to use that term. Layer into that the fact that you actually see the EPA taking actionable policy steps to penalize the combustion of coal for reasons related to mercury, SOx, NOx, particulates, nothing to do with CO2. Because quite frankly, what you see in this projection hasn't factored in what might be coming down the pipe on CO2. Okay? So that's an interesting one to sort of ponder, right? But certainly there's demand growth opportunity for natural gas. When you look at these two sectors down here, commercial, residential, not much going on, right? This is largely due to existing infrastructure basically just being fine. You see efficiency growth in end use, particularly in households, new construction in particular, new appliances, things like that, so it doesn't have that big of an impact on demand. And I know there's going to be some discussion on transportation. It's kind of hard to see up here, but in the forecast, transportation grows pretty rapidly, but it's a thin red line up here at the top. Okay, and this is in trillion cubic feet, so it's not a big number. But there is growth, largely if you break this down by state, which we do, we see most of that growth actually occurring west of the Rockies. And it's largely policy motivated, so it's sort of an interesting sort of thing to begin to think about. So for example, AB 32 in the state of California is going to have a big impact on natural gas and transportation. So LNG, right? This is the other thing that really keeps a lid on demand growing in other places. So you have to realize when you have low prices, it actually creates margins of response in many different margins. It's not just one thing. Similarly, when you have high prices, it creates a margin of response in many different margins, not just one thing. So, you think about this in reverse, going back to the early 2000s, what were we talking about? We were talking about importing liquefied natural gas because from 2003 to 2006, the price in the United States for natural gas was higher than anywhere else in the world. We forget, right? That's only 10 years ago. And so flip that around, today we're among the lowest price. And so now we're talking about exporting. But it's also triggering margins of response on other margins. So demand increases in power generation and in the industrial sector. This blue right here, so this is energy exports, LNG exports by country. What we actually see long term is a significant amount of exports, right? You're talking about roughly 6.5 to 7 BCF a day if you do the conversion here. Okay, that's not a small number. Most people will say, well, given all the licenses that are out there, it's going to be bigger than that. It's got to be, right? Well, I want to put this into perspective. This is Qatar, and this is Australia. Okay? So when you look at the global LNG market, the U.S. coming in at 6.5 makes us the third largest exporter in the world. Sometimes we forget that you've got to fit that wedge of supply into a global market. Price will be impacted as you introduce new supplies, and so these things matter when we're having this conversation. A lot of times people, particularly in Washington, when we're talking about these issues, just assume, well, if we export 20 BCF a day, the sky's falling. Well, guess what? Prices have to be sufficient to support the trade, and quite frankly, they wouldn't be. This is the last slide. This just indicates what we see happening to global market prices around the world. And interestingly enough, you see Henry Hub down here staying on a long-term basis well below JKM and NBP, and it's sufficient to support trade. But this window right here, so over the next from 2016 through about 2020, that price spread actually collapses to the point where it actually disincentivizes new construction and LNG export capability. So what we actually see in terms of a demand source is 4 terminals happening. Okay? That's Sabine Pass, Cameron, Freeport, and the one at Cove Point. Beyond that, it becomes very difficult to motivate the capital expenditure to build any new liquefaction capacity. So this all fits into the picture of new sources of demand for U.S. gas. And by the way, we like to focus on just U.S. supply when we talk about demand, but guess what? We're very, very well connected to Canada. And guess what's in Western Canada? There's a lot of gas shale there.